So today I'll be talking briefly about forensic stasis in a world of flux. I'm going to use the Pinkins case as an example. As was mentioned, this was the first Innocence Project exoneration. We've been involved in other defense cases and acquittals and exonerations. This was the first Innocence Project one. In brief, in 1989, there was a series of bump and rape crimes, and it culminated with 5 men raping an Indiana woman. Darryl Pinkins and 2 other men were misidentified through clothing. In 1991, they were wrongfully convicted, and Mr. Pinkins was sentenced to 65 years in prison. In 2001, there was DNA mixture evidence from 2 of these items of clothing, a jacket and a sweater, and there were 2 major contributors found, and not the accused. Nobody was linked to this, but the appeals court ruled that 5 people were needed, and so post-conviction relief was denied. So a question you may ask is, why did it wait 15 years? Where was the failure? What actually happened? I'm going to talk about that briefly. So the DNA evidence can be quite complex. Most DNA evidence now is mixtures of 2 or more people. A handgun may have 5 people, 6 people. It's present in small amounts. The DNA can be degraded. The signals don't look like 1 or 2 clean peaks. They look like the picture behind me. That make it more difficult for people to interpret. So what people have done for 15 years is to have a simple solution. And this is approximately what they do. If the data is too complex, simplify the data. Throw out the data you don't want to look at. Keep the data you do want to look at. Within the data you want to look at, choose which peaks you want to look at. Choose how much of each peak you want to look at. So you begin by simplifying the data. Then, in many protocols, take a peek at the answer. Who do you want to convict? And then after you do that, and very importantly, only after you do that, you've manipulated the data, you've seen what the answer is supposed to be. Now you put that into a computer program to get a statistic that usually can only give you an inclusionary value to confirm what you have arrived at. And then, the last part is don't tell anybody about the first 2 steps. And that's been DNA mixture practice in the whole country, not just Texas, for the last 15 years. We've heard about the NIS report, which is shown here. What this does is it puts people in the process, which is good, I guess. You have a lot of experts. But the reason they're there is because the software's failed. In real software, you don't have people choosing your data. You don't have people looking at the answer. You just put software into a computer, you run it, and you get an answer. But now you have human experts involved, and this introduces error and bias. The result has been a massive information failure for DNA and hundreds of thousands of evidence items. You've heard about the NICS 05 study, 2005. The National Institute of Standards and Technology took a look at simple 2-person mixtures, sending out an easy trace to over 50 labs. Most found the data to be inconclusive, and the labs that did report a statistic, the answer ranged from 10,000 to 1 followed by 4 zeros, up to 100 trillion, which is a 1 followed by 14 zeros, which is not exactly any consistency in the field. And the NICS 13 study in 2013 found false inclusions on a 3-person mixture in 70% of the laboratories. I wrote a paper in the fall, it's open access, that shows that the CPI statistic, the combined probability of inclusion, is actually a random number. It's just the number of tests. That's why it's always 1 million on the CODIS if there's an inclusion. And it's been closed a few labs, but essentially the numbers that we have don't really mean very much. So what are the results of mixture interpretation? You can have an inclusion, that's a subjective human conclusion with the wrong statistic. You can have an exclusion, that's a subjective result with no statistic. Or you can have an inconclusive, which is probably wrong, where you're discarding probative evidence that could be used to exonerate somebody. What are the forces of stasis that keep us in a situation of using such terrible science? One is a human need for certainty. People like certainty, particularly if they're testifying in court. They're very comfortable giving definite answers. The regulation that we have is a self-regulating hall of mirrors where practitioners all agree that what they're doing is really fine, and that turns into standards. The government, under law, pretty much has a monopoly on forensics. It's very hard to get data to evaluate and oversee what they're doing. The software limitations will reduce work. I mean, if you can't look at 90% of your evidence, that's a lot less work that you have to report on or testify on. You have a situation where there are some lawyers who adamantly fight against truth, for their client. And then you also have another factor that we've seen recently, which is there's a lot of state liability for abusing DNA evidence, and the more you can cover up, the lower your liability. So this is a quick summary of TrueAllele. So here are some capabilities of software you might want to have, and computing. What is TrueAllele, by the way? TrueAllele is a technology where after the laboratories produce data off the machines from the crime lab, the data is put into an interpretation computer. It doesn't look at any answers. It separates out mixtures into the different genetic components up to probability. Those separated genotypes can then be compared with 1, 10, or 1,000 different references in order to calculate a match statistic. If the number is big, like 1 million, that's support that somebody's present. If it's small, like 1 in a million, that's support that they're not present. There's no people or bias in the process. I wrote a long list. I'm not going to go through everything. But the real thing is what's in red. With human-centered review of the type we have now, people choose their data. They deal with uncertainty not by statistical computer modeling or math. They just draw a threshold line and throw out data under it and keep qualitative data over it. They don't tend to be able to exclude people because statistically their software doesn't do that. The number is just a random number rather than probative value. It's basically the number of tests that were done. It's not transparent in the sense that it's the black box of what's going on in somebody's head, as opposed to disclosed mathematics that can be tested with available software and provided to all parties and rerun and validated. And basically, the human approach is not objective. There's been no validation studies on it that I know of. There have been over 30 studies, 7 peer-reviewed on TrueAllele. The answers aren't accurate. If the number is always 1 million or inconclusive, it's like a clock that's stuck at 2 o'clock. It's just either you look at the clock or you don't. It's not automated, or you require people to do every step of the process. I've never had any admissibility hearing that I know of. It's just grandfathered in as really good stuff. It's DNA, so if simple DNA is good, complex DNA must be better, I guess. And it's limited in its applications. It can't do more complex comparisons. So Darryl Pinkins did leave prison. He was released after 24 years. These are 5 different capabilities that the TrueAllele technology had that crime labs don't routinely use or have available to them that assisted with this. And they were all necessary in obtaining the result. TrueAllele could compare evidence with evidence, not just evidence with references. It could calculate exclusionary match statistics to statistically show, not someone's opinion, but objectively, that he wasn't present in the evidence. In addition to the obvious 80 or 90% major contributors, it also pulled out a 5% minor contributor. That wasn't him. It could look at multiple evidence data together and do a joint analysis on DNA mixture data to pull out more information. And I think that ultimately the real thing for the district attorney is that we showed that 3 of the perpetrators at the scene were brothers. They were related. We did that through kinship calculations on the derived genotypes. And there were no brothers in any of the defendants or any story of how they may have been involved. And at that point, the hearing that was scheduled just turned into the day he walked out of jail. So ultimately, the system found 5 unidentified genotypes. The defendants were not linked to the crime. The title of the session is Flux, so the opposite of stasis is flux. What are forces of flux that can lead to social change, which is, I think, why we're here? One is to respect DNA evidence. You can't just willy-nilly choose what you want. You have to respect data. And with accurate computer modeling that we've had in statistics for the last 25 years, you can use all the data objectively. You want to eliminate human bias. In fact, you want to eliminate people completely from statistical calculations. With old web browsers, maybe 20 years ago, you had people sitting at desks facilitating. Now you expect probabilistic algorithms to give you your results when you type queries into Google. We have to accept that variation is what nature is, and to eliminate it in our interpretation is just wrong and not scientific. You need a lot of empirical testing, a lot of validation studies, and that can be done empirically and objectively. And you need lawyers who want to fight for truth, not against it, and really are passionate about finding it in evidence and for society, and to exploit the state's liability for DNA abuse. So DNA injustice is what you get when you have bad forensic science. It can lead to false convictions where innocent people are in prisons. It can lead to false acquittals where people who are guilty go free. And it can lead to unnecessary victimization where people who should have been in jail, who are violent criminals, are out harming the public. But that same DNA injustice can be used to catalyze justice. These hundreds of thousands of inconclusives, and scientific studies, when you do comparisons with different methods, show that most of the informative data that we have in complex mixtures is incorrectly called inconclusive. This is veiled evidence that could be potentially exculpatory, that the state should have disclosed under Brady. The fact that they choose to use pop guns instead of tanks is a choice that they make. It can be viewed as an opportunity. A false conviction is a civil rights violation that can be remedied, at least financially, later on. If someone is tried and acquitted, ultimately, based on bad DNA evidence, there's a potential for malicious prosecution. And if people are unnecessarily victimized because of crimes that shouldn't even have happened from criminals who've been released, there's liability. And one of the features of true allele is that it's not a person, it's a computer. It's a parallel computer. And it's not just a parallel computer. In our office, we run 100 questions at the same time. We can also run things on internet in the cloud. You can be running tens of thousands of questions simultaneously without people having to curate the data. So to reopen the past and take a look at the hundreds of thousands of cases where there's been misinterpreted DNA and evidence that's been suppressed, that can be done automatically as opposed to requiring an army of paid experts to curate the data and give biased and inaccurate answers. So it's a machine for opening up the truth from the last 20 years. If you want more information, there's lots on our site, CLE talks, articles, and so on, but I think I'll stop there. Thank you.